everyone, and welcome to the Surgical Ergonomics podcast, where we will be discussing everything related to surgical and procedural ergonomics, the people, ideas, and technology that will help enhance your physical wellness and career longevity. I am your host, Geeta Lal. I'm an academic endocrine surgeon, speaker, consultant, and surgical ergonomics coach. Having experienced work-related musculoskeletal injury myself, I am committed to increasing awareness of and developing solutions to counteract the impact of poor ergonomics on the professional and personal lives of healthcare workers in procedural areas. Hi, everyone. In this inaugural episode of the Surgical Ergonomics podcast, it gives me great pleasure to have as our guest Dr. Susan Hallbeck. She's the Scientific Director of Human Factors Engineering and Professor of Healthcare Systems Engineering in the Robert D. and Patricia E. Kearns Center for the Science of Healthcare Delivery, and a consultant in healthcare delivery research, as well as a consultant in surgery at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Dr. Hallbeck is also the past president of both the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, as well as the Society for Surgical Ergonomics. She is a licensed professional engineer and a certified professional ergonomist. Hi, Sue, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Geeta. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. My pleasure. I've actually been looking forward to having you on for this episode for a very long time, at least actually as long as when I first decided I would start this podcast. And in fact, I have to tell our listeners that as I was delving into the incidence of work-related injury among surgeons and the topic of surgical ergonomics in general, I kept seeing this name over and over again, and it was Dr. Susan Hallbeck. And I really, really wanted to meet her. And so I connected with her on LinkedIn, and I tried to email her. And finally, we were able to connect over kind of a regional society during the pandemic, and then ended up, forming the core group that became the Society of Surgical Ergonomics. That's a little bit about our story. Now, Susan, I know a little bit more about kind of your path, but I'd like you to tell our listeners a little bit about, where you grew up, your background, your training, and how you landed up in your current role.
It's kind of funny because your listeners, being surgeons, will find this kind of funny. I grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, where I am now. And I would never come back to Rochester. And I was in the Mayo Medical Explorer Scouts. I was debating between being an engineer or being a physician. And I went to surgery with a dog. The dog was fatty. They were using cautery, and I threw up. And that was the end of my surgical career.
Gosh, I'm sorry. That does not sound like a good experience.
It was not good. So then I decided on engineering. And so it all comes full circle, doing surgical ergonomics through engineering.
Wow, that part I did not know. What made you then pursue, I should say, you're a trained ergonomist, a licensed professional engineer in industrial engineering. Why did you pick this area, studying surgeons and surgical ergonomics? I know you just said it came full circle, but how did the interest in this area start?
So going to school, being an engineer, there's so many different types of engineering. The thing that really resonated for me was engineering, as ergonomics. And if I look at that, the thing that really interests me is putting together the task requirements and the human capabilities and making sure that those match so that there's not any injury or illness. And so I was lucky enough to find that as an undergraduate. And then they told me you needed a master's in order to really do it. And I was able to get a NIOSH fellowship to go to Texas Tech then to study. And they gave me money to go to school. That's okay. I'm liking this. And then at that point, I determined that I wanted to be a faculty. And they said, well, you need a PhD. And so then I went to Virginia Tech, and they paid me to go to school. How lucky is that? And then I went off to the University of Nebraska as a faculty member in industrial engineering. And I did a fair amount in meatpacking. And I did some things with industry. And then in 2000, 2002 or so, we had the medical center at Nebraska and the engineering college decided to have a speed dating research meeting. And so I went to that and I met a surgeon, and he wanted to have an instrument created that would have an articulation on the end for laparoscopic surgery. And we decided that we would partner on that and we would make this new instrument. And that's where it started. So I had been doing a fair amount of things like meat packing, industry,
Mm,
and then I was able to take, dare I say it, the meat packing, which was disassembly of tissue, add it to the reassembly of tissue that is surgery, and make something out of that. And so from that opportunity, I went in and saw hundreds of hours of laparoscopic surgery in
I
order to
see.
develop this instrument. And
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
I found was, yeah, I could make one instrument, but there was so many other problems that no one had ever really recognized because they hadn't gone in and observed in the OR. It's hard to get into the OR. It's hard to get people to trust you. It's hard to get, some traction to be in the OR. So for me, it was a great opportunity.
It's such a fascinating experience, to hear you describe this experience. And I wish I maybe had sort of, maybe I was a fly on the wall, maybe in 2002 when you were doing these studies, because I'd love to have seen the reaction when you were looking at surgeons' work through an industrial engineer slash ergonomist's, viewpoint and pointing this out to surgeons. What was that initial reception like? I mean, now we at the Society of Surgical Ergonomics are very, very protective of Dr. Hallbeck and her work. But I can't imagine that was always the case, was it?
It was not always the case, but
Hmm.
all you have to do is take the thorn out of the lion's paw one time, and
I
then
see.
people say, "Oh yeah, that's better. Yeah, I can I feel a little bit better."
So tell us a little bit more about that thorn that you first took out. Would you remember that first thorn you took out?
I think it was with one of the surgeons who was very short, tiny hands. She got up on a number of stools, steps at the OR bedside, and she was trying to use a lot of instruments that just really didn't fit her. And once we figured out some workarounds for her, it really helped. And then once we also had some funding, that always makes a difference, right? And so that those two things in conjunction really made a difference.
I suppose, like you said, it's interesting to have that initial experience. It's like when I think a surgeon equivalent would be you get a test patient, and
Yes.
if the test patient has a good outcome, then you're going to be getting more referrals from that particular physician or practice. So it sounds like that's what happened. But I'm sort of, surprised. You've been doing this when I started looking into this and your name, I kept coming across your name, looking at all the studies and the work that you've been doing in this area. And I was surprised that over the years there's been some off and on interest in surgical ergonomics, but how come we as surgeons didn't know about your work? It was not being published in surgical journals.
It was
Why
not
didn't we know
being
about it?
it
Yeah,
was
why
not
didn't we know
being
about
published in
it?
surgical journals because the surgical journals rejected the work.
I
And
see.
so
So
I
you
published
tried
it
to
in
get it
engineering
published.
journals. And it was because
Ah.
my personal theory, and this is
Hmm.
only my personal theory, is that the surgeon was not the first or last author.
I
And
see.
so it wasn't coming out from surgeons because I saw a lot of things in the surgical literature that was not that different from some of the things that I was doing.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I thought, there we go, we'll do this. And it just didn't happen.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that there's a thought that bringing in somebody from the outside to talk about surgery might not be a good idea. And all I kept saying is, let's partner because you're the
Hmm.
subject
Hmm.
matter expert. I have a skill set. Let's partner. And
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
what Surgical Ergonomics Society is all about, is that partnership.
Right, right. So to a newly minted, let's say, industrial engineer or ergonomics, or I should say ergonomist or human factors researcher that's just starting practice and maybe they're interested in surgical ergonomics, what advice would you give them if they were interested in pursuing this as you did? You know, you trailblazed in this career path because you're one of the early people who did this. What would you tell a newly minted person wanting to do this?
Well, and the only reason I was able to do this is because I did partner with a surgeon even early on. I think
I
that's the
see.
key to success is partner with a surgeon or a group of surgeons
Hmm.
and really make that partnership work for everybody because there's so
Right.
many things still left to deal with. Every time I turn around, I see something else that I want to study.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
there's so many opportunities to fix things in the operating room, not just for surgeons, but the rest of the surgical team as well.
No, you're absolutely right. It's surgical ergonomics is not just about the surgeon. We mean it, surgical procedural ergonomics, to mean sort of the well-being of the whole team. It could be scrub techs, it could be our MAs, it could be our trainees, not just surgeons. So that's important to remember that this is not just about the surgeons. Now, it's going to be really hard to condense your entire illustrious career into this one episode, but I do want to give our listeners an overview of your contributions to the field and the work you've been doing. So, since this is our inaugural episode, let's start off by what exactly is meant by ergonomics. When you're referring to the field of surgical ergonomics, what exactly are we referring to? And then how about some numbers? Usually we don't think of surgical work or procedural work as one of the professions at high risk for work-related musculoskeletal injuries. So can you tell us a little bit more about sort of how common are these diseases among surgeons and other procedural staff? So, definition and then numbers.
Great question. So the word ergonomics means the science of work. It comes from the Greek
Okay.
ergon, which means work, and nomos, which means law. And the term ergonomics and human factors is often interchangeable. Here in the United States, human factors is typically from the neck up and ergonomics is from the neck down. But in Europe, ergonomics is the whole field. So I think there's just a lot of overlap of those definitions. The International Ergonomics Association has made a really great definition that I like.
Hmm.
Ergonomics is the scientific discipline concerned with the understanding of interactions among humans and other elements of a system. And in this case, among the humans and the operating room system. And the profession applies theory, principles, data, and methods to design systems in order to optimize the human well-being. So we've got one side is the human well-being and optimize overall system performance. So it's not just your typical industrial engineering, we're going to make that system run faster, smoother, more efficiently. We also prioritize the human well-being in that system, which is what
Amazing, amazing.
attracts me to this field.
So, given that definition, what did you learn about sort of the incidence, prevalence of work-related MSK symptoms and diseases among, surgeons and other procedural staff in your work over the years?
So that's a really great question. There's been a number of really great systematic reviews that talk about the musculoskeletal disorders among surgeons and interventionalists. And the numbers are between 6 out of 10 and 8 out of 10 in terms of how many people, how many proceduralists and surgeons have self-reported musculoskeletal disorders. And that's a lot of people. I mean, this influences your work, it
Hmm. Hmm.
influences your leisure, and it influences your sleep. And it could
Mm.
have some ramifications on patient safety. And if we look at this, some of the studies that the surveys that I've done personally, we've asked the question, do you fear that your work-related physical discomfort will reduce your ability to perform future surgeries? And
Mm.
shockingly to me, that number is about 50%. That's across general surgery, microsurgery, vascular surgery, Mayo surgeons. It seems to be kind of a pretty high number that
Right.
half the surgeons feel like they have career longevity issues, potential career longevity issues due to musculoskeletal pain.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't know of another industry that has that. So
Wow.
it really reinforces to me that something needs to be done. And in those same surveys, we correlated self-reported burnout and self-reported pain at 4 or higher out of 10. And that was statistically significant. So those people who are in pain also have burnout, or those people who are burnt out also have significant clinically actionable pain. And that's not something that I feel like we should have in people who are doing so much good work that we really need to have, because all of us are going to be patients at one point or another.
Right. These are people taking care of other people at the most vulnerable points in their lives, and they should not be worried about these sorts of things, right?
Right.
And I want to just reiterate for our listeners again what Dr. Hallbeck mentioned. So, the frequency, prevalence, incidence of work related injury symptoms is very high among surgeons and proceduralists, higher than other professions she's seen, much more than what we would expect. And the consequences range not only from those that are personal to the surgeon, meaning affecting their sleep, their well-being, their burnout rates, but and directly their finances, right? And their career
Right.
longevity. But in a broader sense, if we look at it, it's affecting the bottom line of the institutions, the healthcare industries that they work for, patient access. We have a looming surgeon shortage, and I can't imagine that this is going to help that when surgeons are having symptoms and dropping out of the workforce because of them, because their career longevity is reduced. So the bottom line is that poor ergonomics have far-reaching consequences beyond even the individual surgeon. And this is why the Society of Surgical Ergonomics was formed, right? One of the reasons to spread awareness, improve the education around surgical ergonomics, and then try to move the needle around the contributing factors. Now, Sue, as I said, you've got a huge body of work, but I want to just take our listeners through a couple of big ones. So, you've talked about and published on sort of best practices. What are some of the key things you wish all surgical procedural staff knew to do in their daily work inside the OR to reduce the risk of injury?
I think the big part is to stand up straight, have your body in a neutral posture as much of the time as you can,
Hmm.
and use a mat, a gel mat. Have good support under your feet, whether that's, good tennis shoes, good shoes of some sort. Some people like compression hose. But the other parts is try to keep yourself square with the table, whether you're doing open or laparoscopic surgery, and make the operating room fit you, not adapt to whatever's going on. I know that, I still walk into some ORs and I pull down the monitor and say,
Hmm.
now does your neck hurt a little bit less? It's hard to remember to do. And there are some studies I am not part of, but I've heard of them and I think it's great, talking about like a surgical timeout, a surgical ergonomics timeout, pardon me, that people are saying, okay, let's set up the OR for us before we do any incision.
Yeah.
And so getting it all right takes not very long, less than a
Hmm.
minute.
Hmm.
And that can have a long term impact on your comfort, on your ability to keep doing the surgery, especially in long surgeries,
Hmm. Hmm.
and just your future and your mood. When
Hmm.
you're in
Hmm.
pain, everybody knows you're in pain, even if you think you're covering it.
Indeed, indeed. It's hard to hide. It's hard to hide. Don't ask me how I know that. Okay. Well, these are all useful tips for our listeners, no matter what their field is, whether they're doing endoscopy, laparoscopic surgery, open surgery, etc. Now I'm going to bring up a somewhat controversial, contentious issue among surgeons and surgical administrators, the concept of breaks.
Right.
I've always, ever since training, obviously, it's been that our nursing colleagues have breaks built into their workflows, our anesthesia colleagues have breaks built into their workflows. Sometimes, my response as a surgeon, I'm not speaking for all surgeons, has sort of vacillated between envy and, why can't I do that? And, downright, well, if I have to stand here, why should they get breaks? Things like that. So that was until I started delving, of course, into the ergonomics literature. And taking breaks is actually one of the best ergonomic interventions that we can do. And in fact, you're one of the first people to study this in surgeons. So tell us a little bit more about that work, what you found and what came of it and all of that.
So there were a couple of studies that were before the study that I did
Okay.
that did some very small studies
Yeah.
looking at taking a break. Now, whether they were doing exercises, there was one that had a few exercises, the other one was just a really long break. And when I proposed this, this administration said, wait, you're going to have a break? You know how expensive OR time is, right? And I
Yep.
said, yes, I do. And I said, this is a pilot. That's a way to get around a lot of things, is call something a pilot.
Mhm.
And just let's try it and let's see if it actually does lengthen the surgical duration. And so we did a study, and it had 4 sites. And what we found was that there was no statistically significant increase in surgical duration. And once I had that piece of information, it was
Right.
much easier to move forward. Everybody came back refreshed. Everybody thought that it was doing them some good. And so then you can say, okay, it doesn't increase surgical duration. People like it. It's helping with pain and discomfort. So why shouldn't we keep trying it? And
Right.
at that point, we created a web app to help people remember to do it, because that first piece was me in the OR leading people through breaks. I
Mm.
had a stopwatch. We had to do it within certain time periods.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
what we found was that people will do it because it does help them. They feel better after they've had the stretch breaks during their
Mhm.
operating room time.
And
And
it's not just the physical wellness, right? They felt better in terms of their physical symptoms, but also, contrary to what a surgeon might think, taking a break doesn't disrupt the flow of the case and it actually improves their cognitive ergonomics, right?
that's what they report to back. And I
Mm.
think that's person dependent.
Okay.
And if the timer is set correctly, because in the
Hmm,
web app
hmm.
we have basically a little alarm clock with a snooze, and you set the duration. I think that if you set that at a reasonable time where you think there might be a break, where you're going to send something off to pathology, where you're going
Right.
to have some turnover in your team and you need to take a break or need something from the core, you could also just take a
Hmm,
break at that point.
hmm,
But
hmm.
the thing that I've noticed, and we did some studies on this, is that one of the things that surgeons do is they get that tunnel vision, which is awesome
Mm.
for the patient. You are locked in on that patient. Things could
Hmm,
be
hmm,
happening all around you. You are laser focused on that patient. So
hmm,
2 hours may elapse and you would not even know it until you
hmm,
looked
hmm.
up and you went, whoa, my back really hurts.
Mm.
And so having that little alarm that goes off, that it's a little harp, so it doesn't have a near kind of warning
Hmm, hmm,
alarm
hmm.
type sound, but it does help people understand that now's a good time to take a break potentially. And
Got
with
it.
snooze, if it's not a good time, the circulator can just tap the button and we'll get a snooze alarm on it.
That's great. So I'll just let our listeners know that in the show notes will have a link to the OR Stretch app. It's free to use. And as Dr. Hallbeck pointed out, it has a set timer. It has a snooze button if it's not a convenient time in the case. And it's not just about taking a break. It's about taking a break and doing a postural reset. So The app comes with exercises that you can do while sterile, either in the seated or the standing position, to reset the posture that you might have been in, the exaggerated non-neutral postures you might have been in. And a key point is that, when we take these, we call them 2-3 second breaks. We kind of step back and shake our head off and get back to the OR table. That's not enough, right? What did you find, Dr. Hallbeck, that you had to take a minimum? How much of a break is necessary
It's about a
for a
minute.
reset? A
For the
minute.
reset
Okay.
for going through the exercises, which are actually based on neuroflossing, and
Mm-hmm.
they counteract the posture that you're in, it takes about a minute. And you don't have to scrub out for any of this. I wanted to make sure
Right.
that everybody understood that. This is done without breaking scrub.
So for anyone who's interested in trying out breaks in their practice, as I said, we'll put that link in the show notes. And you heard Dr. Hallbeck say, and it's published in the data, if you want to show your department administrators, it does not prolong OR time. So, win-win there.
Right. And I'll call out the URL, which is orstretch.mayoclinic, one word, .org.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Now, we touched on some of the intraoperative things, but we all know that, injuries come from our work both inside and outside the operating room. So, what are some helpful general tips and tricks for people working in the ORs and procedural areas that they can do outside of the OR to reduce their risk of injuries? Some low-hanging fruit, please.
Some low-hanging fruit is to get a good chair. I've
Mm.
seen a lot of you in and outside the OR use those stools that you swirl
Oh, yes.
to raise and lower, and no one raises or lowers them. Get a chair with a good backrest and use that backrest. Lean into it.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Try to set up yourself in any time you're seated with your ankles at a 90 degree, your knees at about a 90 degree, your hips at about a 90 degree, leaning into a lumbar support if you can, elbows at a 90 degree, and make sure that your display, and this is true for your work at your desk, when you're in the dictation room, whatever,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
is the top of the display is about at your eye height. Same
Mm.
with laparoscopic surgery. You want that top of the display at your eye height. And that gives you a really good neck flexion angle, which is very slight, but your eyes then can look down a little bit, which is how they're designed to be. Then make sure that you have your keyboard at the right height and you don't have your mouse way off on some other side. You can pull under the desk. I don't know how many times I've seen a computer on a cabinet with no knee room. So somehow
Mm-hmm.
you're sideways and you're trying to type. So you just have to take 30 seconds, set up your workspace. I know all of you think, just like when you
Mm-hmm.
sit down at the robot, that if you sit down at a computer, I'm going to be here for 2 minutes. And 30 minutes later, you're still there and you're not accommodating yourself.
Yeah.
So adjust the chair, adjust the monitor, adjust whatever's adjustable in your environment. Make
Mm-hmm.
it fit you,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is the gist of ergonomics,
which is the
right?
gist of ergonomics, right?
The definition
And
says
if you're using a
design for
laptop,
comfort. Mm-hmm.
if you're going to use it for a long period of time, they're great for traveling. Get a
Yeah.
laptop stand and put it on the laptop stand and get a standalone keyboard, because
Mm.
otherwise you're looking down, the same posture you're doing in open surgery. And one of the
Right.
things that we've been seeing is that neck problems are very prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
Those are driven by things like loops, headlights, looking down
Mm-hmm.
at the
Mm-hmm.
surgical field in open surgeries. And one of the studies that we did across the entire house of surgery was that we saw that 65% of the duration for these surgeons was in awkward postures. And that was across 116 surgeries over 53 surgeons. So
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
something that's really, really prevalent. And we then
Mm-hmm.
pulled out the open surgery versus lap surgery. And what we
Mm-hmm.
found was that was statistically significantly different. So lap surgery has different issues. They've got shoulder issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But for open surgery, the neck flex position is a real problem. And that
Mm-hmm.
leads
Mm-hmm.
us to, one of the other things that we're trying to do is figure out how we can have some sort of intervention. You
Mhm.
named one, which is our stretch. And some
Mhm,
people
mhm.
like it and some people don't.
Mhm.
My goal is to come up with a cafeteria menu of different things that other people might like.
I
And
see.
some of those might be an exoskeleton.
Mhm, mhm, mhm.
And there's
Well,
other things that we haven't even thought of yet that maybe could counteract.
right. No, you bring up an excellent point with exoskeletons, and I think this is a good place for me to remind our viewers that there will be a whole episode of this podcast on exoskeletons in the future. So more to come on that. I think that merits its whole, individual episode. But just to reiterate what you said for our listeners and just kind of drive that point home that, see, this is low-hanging fruit. If you just examine your office at work and your home office and maybe even the clinic space, and take those 2 minutes to adjust the table and the chair, as Dr. Hallbeck has outlined, you'll mitigate some of that forward head posture result. We're doing forward head posture in the OR, we're doing forward head posture out of the OR. So we're subjecting ourselves to not only operative stressors, but the same stressors that office workers face and end up, at the physical therapist with the similar complaints, right?
Right.
So, absolute, this is, advice that is spot on and that we should all take a look at. I now want to turn attention just, in the last few minutes that we have to actually a study that Dr. Hallbeck has been leading, in conjunction with the Society of Surgical Ergonomics. And we all know that a big sort of contributor to poor ergonomics and work-related injury for surgeons and proceduralists is actually our instrumentation, right? Whether it be endoscopes, whether it be laparoscopes, staplers, etc. All of these instruments are considered sort of heavy hitters or high offenders when it comes to surgeons of varying hand sizes. Now, surgeons with small hand sizes tend to be more commonly women, but they don't have to be. So if you fall outside of like the median hand size or the mean hand size, you're going to run into some problems because instruments come in one size. So to address some of this, obviously we have the Society's Industrial Collaborations Committee. We recently had a webinar in December, which will be on our website, and I will post that with the show notes as well with this episode. But we are looking at the current surgical workforce's hand size distribution. There's more to it than that, but we're briefly going to call it the hand size study. So I'm going to ask Dr. Hallbeck to elaborate why this kind of study is necessary, meaning what is the data that industry is using currently to design these instruments? So why is this study needed, and what are we hoping to accomplish by this study?
So the data that industry is using is either proprietary or
Mm-hmm.
military data and other data that is not necessarily surgeons. So it's a random population that is not surgeons. I don't
Hmm.
know if that's is appropriate because there are certain things that surgeons have that some other people don't have. When I worked with firefighters, for example, they had really big hands. I did not see any small-handed males or females in that group. And that was probably due to the fire hoses and other equipment that they used. But what we're trying to do is come up with a database, if you will, of hand sizes and looking at glove size as a metric and determining whether that's a reasonable metric or not. Because a lot of the times we don't have your actual hand dimensions, we have your glove size. And each brand of glove is slightly different. And what we found across the about 600 surgeons that we've looked at so far, and about 60% of these are women, is that the distribution is about the mean, median, and mode for females is about 6.5 size glove, while for males it's about 7.5.
Hmm.
And overall, about 60% of the respondents said they had difficulty using current surgical instrumentation due to either hand size or hand strength. And that about 60% said was mostly females at 85% and 15% male. And about half of the respondents said they felt the sizing of the instrumentation impacted their ability to perform the surgery. So doing the job, about half the people said that the instrumentation size impacted their ability to do the work. And again, that was about 70% female and about 30% male.
Wow.
So the thing that really gets to me is that the comments that we got in this.
Hmm.
And one of them said, as a general surgery resident, I struggled to use nearly all staplers one-handed. I had difficulty using all energy devices because some buttons and triggers were hard to reach. My
Hmm.
economy of motion was compromised, and I was told by larger-handed, predominantly male attendings that my skills were inferior to those of larger-handed, again, predominantly male residents. In contrast, attendings with similarly sized hands, predominantly but not exclusively female, told me I had excellent skills. Things like that really resonate for me as an ergonomist, where I'm putting
Mm.
you surgeons, or someone is, putting you in a position where you have to overcome not only the patient sickness, the patient variability, whatever other things are going on with that patient. We're putting you in a system and giving you tools and instruments that are not usable. So I'm actually putting you at disadvantage. And that's just not okay.
Wow. Well, I have to say, when I first saw your data, it was eye-opening to say the least. But honestly, I was surprised, but maybe not entirely surprised because that's kind of the gestalt one gets. I echo the sentiments of the resident, the comment that you mentioned. I've always struggled with using staplers one-handed. Now, I haven't used staplers in years because I do exclusively head and neck endocrine surgery, but I remember those comments as a resident being told, oh, you need to just work out more. And you know what? It didn't help even after I worked out because the hand span made a difference. It wasn't just about the finger length or the glove size, right?
Right.
So this is why the work that you're doing we in the society are doing is going to be, I think, very impactful to help drive change in how instruments are designed. I mean, at a minimum, I'm neither a design engineer nor an ergonomist, but just listening to that, the question that goes through my mind is, why doesn't every instrument come in two sizes, right?
Well, you want
So,
the answer to that? It's stocking. I mean, think about your core and your central supply.
yeah, exactly.
You've
Cost,
got,
space, stocking,
yep,
all of the above. Fascinating and really sort of, this sort of work brings more questions. It answers some questions, but it always brings up more questions.
it does. And I would say that one of the things that we did do is go to two different surgical society meetings. And
Mm,
you were a great person to advertise for us, walking around and push them to the booth where we could measure that, not only the survey that we had, but measure their hands and their strength in person.
mm, mhm,
And
mhm,
that is showing some really interesting findings between the glove size and the hand size itself, as well
mhm,
as
mhm,
the strength that people can exert. And it's
mm.
not just hand size, it's also strength.
Okay.
And a lot of
So,
these require a lot of these instruments require a lot of force.
well, I think a lot of our smaller handed surgeons will find these, comments and data very interesting because, contrary to what we might have been told or heard, it's not in our head. There's a reason behind why we have trouble handling certain instruments or working with certain instruments. For our listeners, I will include the link to this hand size study as well in the show notes in case you're interested. Dr. Hallbeck gave me too much credit for pushing people to the booth. I have to tell you that there was no pushing required because the moment I said, "Do you have trouble using staplers? Would you like us to help? Would you like to help us with a hand size study?" People just flocked to the booth. I didn't have to do much selling over there. But I will put the link to this study in the show notes. And if you have time, it just takes a few minutes to fill out the questions of the survey. And since we're not measuring your hands in person, there is a picture that you can take with your credit card in the palm of your hand and upload it. It's all anonymous and you'll contribute to the data, which should hopefully inform instrument design in the future.
Yeah, make
I
sure
see
you
that,
put your
yeah.
credit card on the side that doesn't show, or if you have a that's the same size as, we are going through and editing that out if we find it. So we won't be doing anything untoward.
There might be more shopping in my future, Susan, if you find any more numbers. But yes, no, we are very ethical and we will not be using any numbers. I see that, I always love chatting with you, Susan, and I can't believe that, our time that I'd set aside for this recording is actually up. And so before we wrap up, or as we wrap up, I want to thank you again very, very much for your time and your expertise, not only for the work that you've been doing, unbeknownst to all of us in surgery for a very long time, and also for the work that you continue to do in both HFVS and SSE, for just being, but also just for being so deeply invested and passionate about helping surgeons and proceduralists and all of us working in the OR and procedure suites. And we wish you much success, and hopefully I'll have you back for another episode of the podcast down the road.
Thank you. And I do appreciate the fact that so many surgeons have been so open with me and available and sharing their experiences so that we can actually make some change. Even if we move the needle a little bit, we've moved the needle.
Absolutely, and well said. On that note, bye for now, everyone. Until next time. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media, Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We love feedback, so please reach out to us for topics, ideas, speakers, or if you ever want to be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.